official part of this event.
Yeah.
And we will now begin. And I am thrilled to be here and to welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Dr. Bonita Lawrence. I'd like to welcome Catherine Martin. I'd like to welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us tonight. We will begin with a welcome by Catherine Martin.
Kwe, Medawalokdiok, Nin Gadalin an Maltai, and it Welagiskok. It was a beautiful day. I'd like to welcome you in a Mi'kmaq way and to our unceded Mi'kmaq territory. And I'm speaking to you all from Chibuktuk, which is Halifax, the big bay or the head of the bay or the large water bay. And this is the area of my ancestors right across the water here, off over on the other side in Dartmouth. My family lived at Tufts Cove during the Halifax explosion. They were hunters and trappers, my great granddad's side. And so they trapped and hunted this territory from here down to Tatamagouche and over to Kentville and over to Parsboro and Stewiacke and Musquodoboit. So I welcome you to the hunting district of my ancestors. And I also welcome you to the territory, to the nation. And that spans from Newfoundland down to Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and parts of Quebec. So that's my welcome. We've always welcomed everybody, the new immigrants, French and the British immigrants, hundreds of years ago. We welcomed people before then. We lived for 14,000 years before the arrival of the new immigrants, the French and the British. And we continue under our Peace and Friendship Treaty to welcome people to our land, to our territories. And the basis of our governance was and always will be is sharing. So that's what we know, to share. We did not know about owning Mother Earth because that's really not possible. You can't own the mother. So Mother Earth, like our mother, gave us everything we need to survive while we're in her womb. And just like the ocean, Mother Earth's womb water, she gives us everything we need for all people to live. And right now, what's so important in our world is to honor the water, the clean water that she's been giving us for more years than probably scientists know. And only in 500 years, that's become almost impossible, clean water and clean air. So we need to thank our water, thank Mother Earth and Grandmother Moon for keeping us alive this long, and pray that this world, through pandemics and climate changes, will turn their behavior around and consider first what keeps us alive, air and water, and work together towards that. So right now I'm trying to get just down the road, get some people together to talk about protecting the sweetgrass patches that are at Peggy's Cove and are under a bit of threat to be destroyed or not accessible for us. So in the keeping with my teaching from Sarah Denny of Eskasoni, she told me always to sing this chant when nations gather and when we gather people together. It's the Feast Chant, and it's a good time to be singing it because we're almost at our midwinter feast, early February, when we do our ceremonies to thank the spirits for allowing us to live this long through the winter and to provide enough for us to get through the rest of the winter. Guano day, guano day, guano day, guano danai, guanalia, guano danai, guanalia, guano danai, guanalia, guano day, guanalia, guano day. Wanalia, wanoda, ego, ego, igana. Wanalia, wanoda, nahi. Wanalia, wanoda, nahi. Wanalia, guanode. Wanalia, guanode. Wanalia, guanoda. Hey, deyoka, deyoka. Deyoka, deyoka. Wanalia, wanoda, nahi. Wanalia, wanoda, nahi. Wanalia, wanode. Wanalia, wanode. Wanalia, wanoda. Eya, eya. So I'd like to welcome Bonita to our territory, Dr. Bonita Lawrence, and I'll be back. I'll probably be listening in while you're talking, and I hope you enjoy your time here in Mi'kma'ki. Walalan and Walalio to all of you, and Walalan Derota for pulling this together.
Well, Alan, Catherine, that was wonderful.
Thank you so much. And Kathy, I got so happy and excited to see both of you that I omitted my introduction. And although Kathy Martin needs no introductions in Chibacto, I would like to welcome you again. Thank you so much. And say just a few words, if you don't mind. Catherine Martin is currently serving as Dalhousie University's first Director of Indigenous Community Engagement. And she's herself a graduate of Dalhousie's theater department. We, of course, here know Kathy as an internationally recognized award-winning filmmaker and producer. She's the recipient of the Order of Canada in 2017. We are also very proud that and honored that she's been serving on the University of King's College Board of Governors.
Yeah.
And Catherine Martin is the member of the Millbrook First Nation in Truro, Nova Scotia. She's a wonderful storyteller and drummer and singer. I'm very grateful that she is able to join us to have offered this welcome. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you. And on my part, I am now sitting here in my office at the University of King's College. And I would like to acknowledge that this university sits in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, or Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties recognized the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations which this university where I'm sitting right now is obligated to honor. And now I have a great pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Bonita Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence is a professor in the Department of Humanities at York University in Toronto. She's a founding member of the Indigenous Studies program, in which she currently teaches. Just a word, the Indigenous Studies program at York was established in 2018. It's a unique program that offers its students experiential learning of local Indigenous traditions, treaties, and languages, combined with the theoretical knowledge by Indigenous scholars. Dr. Lawrence's doctoral degree is in sociology and equity studies. That's from U of T. She also holds degrees in environmental studies and geology. And Dr. Lawrence's research and publications have focused primarily on urban, non-status, and Métis identities, federally unrecognized Aboriginal communities, and Indigenous justice. She's the author of Fractured Homeland, Federal Recognition and Algonquin Identity in Ontario that came out in 2012. And Rio, Indians and Others, Mixed Race, Urban Native People and Indigenous Nationhood, which came out in 2004. She's also co-author with Kim Anderson of a collection of essays entitled Strong Women's Stories, Native Vision and Community Survival. And last year, Dr. Lawrence published a novel, which is entitled Nin Bla Away in Clan, Mi'kmaq Sojourns in England, which through a series of vignettes traces the interconnections between the Mi'kmaq people of Atlantic Canada and London, England over the last 5 centuries, and which I have just downloaded on Kindle, and I really look forward to reading it starting tonight. So maybe I would just, a few reminders. This event is scheduled to conclude at 8:30. Following Dr. Lawrence's talk, there will be a Q&A, which I will moderate. We ask you to submit your questions through the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to read them in order that they have been received, and please keep your questions short and to the point. For the duration of the event, it's probably best that you keep your screen in speaker view. So you should see a button in like up top in the right-hand corner that says view, and you can switch it to speaker view. Please be reminded that this event is recorded. Maybe let me just say that at an event honoring Martin Luther King last Monday, which was organized by Black Student Advising Center, there were very important questions raised about the relations between African Canadians and Canadian Indigenous peoples, the two communities that have suffered genocidal violence in the settler colonial state of Canada. And this is the subject that Dr. Lawrence will discuss tonight. The talk is entitled Living in Reciprocity, Historical and theoretical approaches to perspectives on Indigenous-Black relations. So welcome, Dr. Bonita Lawrence, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. When you mentioned my new novel, I had to laugh because although I thought that Nin Bla Away in Clan, I live in England, would be clear to Mi'kmaq people, I've been told by Mi'kmaq people that they're not quite sure what that title means. I was taught by Gabe Marshall of Eskasoni in Toronto, and I think we learn phonetically, and so I do apologize for that. But anyway, I want to talk about tonight's subject. So, Midawalain, Ninda Luisi Bonita Lawrence. I'm of Mi'kmaq, Acadian, backgrounds on my mother's side and English on my father's side. And my mother's primary connection to our heritage, I have great grandparents who are, documented, but my mother's primary connection to our heritage was through her relatives who continued to live in Shediac after the reserve was dissolved in 1895. And most of the people then left for Elsipogtog, but my mother's family, mixed bloods and with an Acadian father, had to move to Moncton instead. So her generation, all landless and jobless, left New Brunswick looking for work. For that reason, while I learned about Mi'kmaq culture and history from elders, mostly in Toronto, I'm very aware that although I'm being zoomed into the land of my ancestors, it's no longer my home in very practical ways. It's my home spiritually, I still feel, but not practically. For that reason, I don't speak for those who live in Mi'kmaq territories. But I'm also aware that I'm speaking in a context, it's the only place in Canada where large-scale contact and intermarriage between Mi'kmaq people and Black people has taken place for over 200 years. Nowhere else in Canada have such relations between Indigenous and Black people taken place in such depth and for so long. For that reason, I'm really honored to be asked to speak here by Zoom tonight. So the talk, and excuse me because I'm suffering with a bit of a cold, so forgive me for that. But this talk is about living in reciprocity through both historical and theoretical frameworks. Historically, relations between Indigenous peoples and Black people have mostly been positive. However, there's been tensions between both groups that need addressing. And then there's theoretical framing, which is starting to happen nowadays. And that's created its own tensions and possibilities. For those who have intergenerational intermarriage and are both Black and Mi'kmaq, those positive relations and tensions are, of course, lived out within families and communities. And I'm going to start by speaking broadly of these contexts across the Americas, because I think, before I focus on Nova Scotia, because I think when you look at relations between Indigenous peoples and Black peoples, it's good to talk about larger contexts before the specific ones. My apologies. I think the first thing to say is that repercussions of colonization and chattel slavery, chattel as in the sense that people who were reduced to objects, both legally and economically, and that was the difference between the slave trade in Africa and all other forms of slavery. And it was the British who really established that legally Native peoples were objects, and economically they could be traded then. So that slave ships could have insurance for their losses. In any case, those repercussions continue to shape lives today, both for Mi'kmaq people or for Indigenous peoples generally, and for Black people. And it shapes their interrelations today. I'm going to have to drink some water. My apologies. But the thing is that both colonization and chattel slavery varied in a number of ways across the Americas. Each regime, whether it was the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, or the British, did it in different ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those different ways. It's a bit of a historical trip through the Americas, but I think it's important. The Spanish and Portuguese established colonies in the Caribbean, in Mexico, and South America way before the English or the French. And they were dealing with huge numbers of Indigenous peoples. There were over 25 million people living in the Indigenous peoples, living in the Central Valley of Mexico alone, right? So Indigenous peoples in these southern regions also, many of them had been organized into great empires for hundreds and hundreds of years before, well, thousands of years before the, the Spanish ever arrived. For that reason, the invasion, and it was invasion and conquest, which it wasn't the case elsewhere, took place in a very brutal fashion. And it started with Columbus and Hispaniola. 8 million Tainos lived there, and most of the Taino leadership was burned alive to break up community resistance, to subjugate the communities. And millions of Tainos were then shipped out into slavery or murdered if they resisted. And then this process moved all the way down through Mexico, Central America, South America. The Spanish had the first sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and initially they relied completely on Indigenous slavery. And the thing is, they had to be imported from other areas because you can't enslave Indigenous peoples on their own lands. Their relatives will help free them, and they know the land. So if you're going to enslave Native peoples, you have to enslave them somewhere else. So they moved Indigenous peoples around. And for the first century of sugar plantations in the Caribbean under the Spanish, Indigenous peoples far outnumbered Africans. But the other issues to talk about when you come to the Caribbean is this notion that Indigenous peoples went extinct. Very few Spanish settled in the Americas, and especially in the Caribbean. And they were urban people. They never went outside of either the plantation or the little towns they established, which meant that Taino people were all over the countryside, those who would have aided the soldiers. The British took over Jamaica in 1699. They were talking about there were loads of Taino people still in the countryside, right? But under the brutality of British slave plantations, where everything was under control, they had to flee to the mountains, both in Jamaica and on Hispaniola, what became the French side, that became Haiti, because French colonialism, slave plantations were equally brutal and all controlling. So you often hear about maroon communities in Jamaica, but they were established with Taino people. And even in Haiti, where people really recognize that the African roots of Haiti are still apparent today, but it's on a Taino imprint. So Taino people didn't go extinct. And those societies still are influenced by the Taino people. Meanwhile, in the small islands of the Caribbean, the Caribs fought against the British for over 200 years. They prevented the growth of sugar plantations until the early 1800s. They couldn't have done that if there hadn't been a shipwreck of African peoples who joined them, and they fought together, Caribs and so-called Black Caribs. And they were joined by by escaping slaves as well. The British hit upon the ability to finally break the Carib resistance by deporting the Black Caribs. They're just Black, they're not Carib. Deport them. They were sent to the island of Roatan, and from there, they traveled to Honduras and Belize, and they're known as the Garifuna today. They still speak a modified version of the Carib language, has more African words in it, but they speak more Carib than many Carib people, other Carib people today do in the Caribbean. And they basically, they honor both their indigenous ancestry from the Caribbean and their indigenous ancestry from Africa. They're truly a blended people. Once the Black Caribs were deported, Carib resistance was broken. Only 3 islands, Dominica has a Carib reserve, St. Lucia has a Carib area, and Caribs live in one community in Trinidad. But so this colonization in the Caribbean, where it's assumed that Native peoples vanished, this didn't happen. Moving on, in South America, Native slaves in Spanish silver mines in what is now Bolivia and Mexico stayed underground mining for a week at a time. They had to produce a certain amount of quota every day. Was phenomenal. 4 out of 5 miners died within a year from overwork, from mining silver all day, from malnutrition, and finally from poisoning. The silver was in cinnabar, which has mercury, so they were dying of mercury poisoning. In some mines, the average life span of a miner was 3 months. African slaves in those places, you had to get out into the mountains, especially in Bolivia. And the cost of importing African peoples was so expensive that they couldn't be, in the Caribbean, they could be worked to death. In Bolivia, especially for this large mine that produced 20 tons of silver within the first 50 years, the Potosi mine. Anyway, so Africans were kind of penned up in the mint, stamping out silver massively all the time, enslaved in there, stamping out all of that silver into coins. And between 1493 and 1800, basically, the lifespan of slavery, 85% of the world's supply of silver, 70% of the world's supply of gold came from the Americas, from this kind of mining. And the Spanish also had plantations, you know. So it was fairly unique. The Portuguese, meanwhile, had such a large empire in Brazil. They had massive numbers of indigenous peoples there. It was easy to simply move Native peoples around, take them from one region to another region where they didn't know the land and had no relations, and work them there. And that went on for quite a long time. They began importing Africans fairly early in the slave trade, however, and in all, they had the largest slave trade of them all. 40% of all Africans imported into the Americas went to Brazil. Almost 5 million Africans survived to be enslaved in Brazil. So in both Spain and Spanish and Portuguese colonies, Native peoples and Black peoples were enslaved side by side. They fought in resistances together, slave uprisings and native wars of resistance. Their histories included conflict at times, as with all peoples. But on the whole, the conditions of colonization didn't divide them so forcibly as in other places. In terms of French colonialism, the French could not colonize what they called Acadia, Mi'kmaq, directly, when Grand Chief Membertou negotiated a concordat with Rome in 1610. So Mi'kmaq became politically at the same level of the French. The French couldn't establish the kind of colonies in a kind of colony in Mi'kmaq as they did in what became Quebec, so-called New France. In New France, 2/3 of all slaves were native. Canada, it's because Canada is the only region of the Americas where plantation slavery was uneconomic. Native slaves could work the land for one crop, but what do they do in the winter? Shovel snow. So basically, to be profitable, you work people day and night, 365 days a year. In Canada, people would work on farms. They would also work basically in households. And slavery wasn't intergenerational. Most slaves were imported young and they simply died in service. And New France couldn't import Africans directly. I think they wanted to, but they didn't have real wealth producing industries at the time. And meanwhile, they were exploring all over the Americas, so importing native slaves, also from what was happening in Carolina, but I'll talk about that later. So most slaves here were native until only when slave owning Americans settled in Canada in 1750 in Nova Scotia when the Acadians were deported. And later, while white loyalists brought in more Black slaves in Nova Scotia and in what became Eastern Ontario, gradually the numbers of Black slaves in Canada equaled and ultimately surpassed the numbers of native slaves for the last 50 years of slavery in Canada, which was outlined in the 1830s. So the thing is, even though in Spanish and Portuguese colonies, Africans were imported and colonies were established on Indigenous land, and Africans were imported for centuries before they ever came to the 13 colonies. Our understandings of Native and Black relations are largely built on the US example of the British 13 colonies. And the first slaves did land in Virginia with the establishment of the Virginia colony in 1604. But for a very big reason, significant importation of slaves didn't take place until 1715. And that was largely because of a native slave trade coming out of the other southern colony, which was Carolina. And Carolina was settled by failed colonists from Barbados. I hope that you're following this. I hope this isn't too abstract. What I'm trying to give you a sense of is that in some places, Native and Black relations worked well. In other places, things divided them. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the case of the 13 colonies. Carolina was settled by failed plantation owners from Barbados. They wanted their chance to create plantations in the South. And they expanded so much because of its trade in native slaves that ultimately Carolina, the one colony, became not only North and South Carolina, but Mississippi, Alabama, and parts of Georgia. This was a huge colony. And the trade they did in native slaves was so huge and allowed them to take so much land that for almost 200 years, after everybody else was importing Africans, Carolina exported more slaves than she imported. And she expanded. What Carolina did was unique and caused all the problems that followed. They expanded by forming alliances with different native peoples to fight other native peoples, and then to acquire their war captives and to convince them to sell their war captives to them. Once they had driven a nation almost to extinction through war, they seized the remainder of them, sold them as slaves, and took their land. Then they began all over again, forming new alliances, encouraging one nation to go to war with another, to sell them their war captives. And once they had driven that nation to almost extinction, they seized the remainder of the captives, took their land, and went onwards. They threw most of the southeast of what is now the USA into war, which is what happened in much of West Africa. People could either be enslaved or enslave each other, right? Meanwhile, Carolina traded native slaves up and down the coast and over to the Caribbean. 2 native slaves cost the same as 1 African because there's tremendous investments involved to bring slaves from Africa. Finally, in 1715, after this had gone on, there were 4 big groups remaining in the Southeast. All the small nations were gone pretty much. Well, not entirely, but a lot of them were gone. 4 remaining confederacies: the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws. They were big, big peoples. Some were confederacies and some were just one nation. And they got together with another group, the Yamasees, in what they called the Yamasee War. And they decided enough is enough. They fought and they nearly defeated Carolina. After that, the trade in native slaves they realized was far too dangerous. So Carolina, with the massive profits they'd made in all that trading in native slaves and with all that land, began importing Africans. And then you start to see Africans are imported hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more every year. 300 one year, 500 the next, 800 the next, 2,000 within 5 years, 2 more thousand. It snowballed. But it was the trade in native slaves that stopped it. And this has been the root of what transpired to divide so many Native and Black people in the US. And it's kind of taken as the example for what happens between Native and Black people. After Carolina had spent over a century stirring up warfare and convincing Native people to sell their war captives, having learned how to turn their own war captives into commodities for trade, I think corrupted them. I think it originated with that. Plus, they now realized that they had these large slave-owning white plantations right on their doorstep. So how are they going to react? Most of them began to enslave Africans themselves. The Cherokees went all out. They were afraid of being deported to Oklahoma. So they actually did what they called so-called civilizing themselves. They adopted US processes. They took women away from owning the land. They turned the land into private property and disenfranchised both Native people and Cherokee women. In such contexts, you can have large-scale plantations. Provided you have private property and Native slaves are disenfranchised, you can enslave them. So plantation slavery was very large on Cherokee plantations. The other 3 groups, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Creeks, they still maintained women controlling the land. So although they took slaves, most of it was personal. On the edges of the territory, and especially where mixed bloods were situated, they tended to have some plantations there. The Creek Confederacy actually fought a war about slavery, the Red Stick War. It wasn't that they felt for Africans. What they felt was that slavery was the essence of what was wrong with Europe and that Europe was imposing themselves. So they wanted to purify themselves of European contact, and they lost. So the Creeks, who didn't want to engage in slavery, fled to Florida, joined up with the Uchis there, and formed what was known as the Seminoles. Africans escaped from slavery, joined them, and became the Black Seminoles, where they spoke the Seminole language. Well, it was 2 languages, really, Creek and Uchi. Adopted all of the cultural values of the Seminole peoples. And they fought with the other Seminoles against first the British attempts to invade them, and finally the Americans. And ultimately they end up fleeing to Mexico because slavery was still happening in the US. And as Black and Native peoples, they could not afford that. So this experience, the fact that the Creeks, Chickasaw, and then they ended up going back to Oklahoma after slavery. But this experience of the Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Cherokees, and some of the Seminoles who ended up in Oklahoma owning slaves, the ones who were not mixed with Black. This was a huge rupture in Native-Black relations that existed nowhere else to such an extent. The only other case we've heard of is that in Southern Ontario, the family of Joseph Brant, and they were, really acculturated Haudenosaunee people, Mohawk people who had married into British administrators, and that their family owned 3 or 4 slaves as servants. Those 2 examples, this massive plantation slavery issue in the US and Joseph Brant in Ontario, I think those are the only examples we've been able to find of Native peoples actually owning African slaves. But this created a huge distrust among Black peoples for Native slave owning across the board, outside of the context in which it happened. The other thing that was uniquely divisive about Native people and Black people in the US was that the massive armies of the Civil War in 1865 were then turned westward to conquer the West. And the Civil War was tied to colonization anyway, because they only got northern, white soldiers to fight for the North by promising them land in Western Canada. In Western US. So after the war, you just turn the armies westward. But of all the white troops who moved west, the situation of freed slaves is important. They were denied reparations during the Reconstruction period. The 40 acres on a mule didn't happen. Centuries of being chattel, enriching others through their slave labor. Black men joined the military in huge numbers. It was the only means to make a living, and it provided a structure for family and community for lives destroyed by slavery. So the Black regiments were sent west. And although the mythology of the so-called Buffalo Soldiers was that Native peoples honored them as valiant allies, the name refers to the fact that curly hair on Africans resembled the hair on the curly hair on the head of the buffalo. The fact was, they were part of the American military. They didn't take part in massacres such as the Wounded Knee Massacre, but they were there on backup for those soldiers. And for the most part in the Southwest, they fought Indian wars. They basically helped to defeat Geronimo. They helped to defeat a lot of the sort of last struggles of Indigenous peoples to remain autonomous. The irony is, having helped to win the West for white people, where they had no power there, they ended up settling down mostly with the Native families that they'd helped defeat, and they created Black Native families across the West. So these two features in the US, Native people practicing chattel slavery and Black troops being listed as Indian fighters, part of the manner in which colonization and slavery divided Native and Black people in the US like nowhere else. Many times they fought together against slavery and against land occupation, and those struggles were magnificent, but these fundamental forces divided them. So that's the history across the Americas. And I hope it's been all right. I hope it hasn't bored people. From what I've been told in Nova Scotia, many Black people took in Native people who'd been decimated by scalping policies and starvation. And probably early Black settlers also relied on Native people to learn how to survive in such a hostile northern landscape, well, hostile to them. Black Native alliances began here and then continued there. I'm talking about Mi'kmaq, began here and continued for the next 200 years. In some cases, very positively, and in some cases with a little difficulty. I wanted to talk a little bit about theory before coming back to Nova Scotia. I'm aware that it's 6:42. I think I have till 7:30. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theoretical things. There's been a lot of theorizing about Black Native relations lately, and most of it comes out of the activism of the period of the past 10 to 15 years by Black people, by Indigenous peoples, and by the manner in which Black people have begun to support Native activism. And in some ways, these theoretical framings have been plagued by the ways in which both Black and Indigenous peoples have tended to view their alliances primarily from within their own frameworks. So Native people are interpreted through a Black framework and Black people are interpreted through a Native framework. But first I want to talk, and as an amateur here, of my understandings of developments within Black thought. Again, it's important to be amateurs in each other's fields. While Black activism, especially recently, has focused to a tremendous extent on police murders of Indigenous peoples, for many years they've been struggling against the massive injustices that Black people face in the United States. So many Black American theorists have struggled to understand why Black people so apparently lack even the most basic human rights. And they've made the connections that having been chattel, objects owned by others, for so long has shaped Black experience in fundamental ways. Scholars such as Saidia Hartman have theorized the multiple ways that Black people today are living in the afterlife of slavery, that having been chattel is reflected in the treatment of Native peoples today. And Sylvia Winters has addressed how the very category of human was based on the exclusion of Africans as chattel, and that this shapes how Black people continue to be viewed as non-humans, lacking basic human rights. Even after decades of civil rights struggles, won rights to vote, outlawed legal segregation, and yet Native peoples fundamentally cannot depend on the law to protect them. Other scholars such as Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton developed the idea of Afro-Pessimism, which addresses the idea that the oppression of Black peoples is so extreme that they should not even be able to ally with other racialized or Indigenous peoples, because inevitably they will be betrayed. They also tend to collapse, however, Africans in Africa with Black people in the US as quintessential survivors of the slave experience, which fails to address the vast differences between African colonization and those facing the afterlife of slavery in America. So in some ways, it's a sort of a body of theory that results in no activism at all. But fundamentally for Black people, because their bodies were enslaved and their bodies are marked racially, and slavery destroyed their knowledge of African indigeneity, their relationship to their own lands, their own languages, all that was destroyed by slavery. And so for Black people, questions of identity focus on Blackness, on racial identity, on the ways that Black people's bodies are considered fungible. I had a lot of trouble understanding the meaning of the word fungible. It's taken to mean objects on which colonizers have utilized in multiple ways. And Tiffany Lethabo King has described it. She says, one way I've explained fungibility is to think about the slave owner, Madame Delphine Lalaury's use of enslaved bodies in the FX television series, American Horror Story, Coven. Lalaury uses black flesh to meet uses and desires beyond those of labor and profit. She runs a torture chamber in order to satisfy lusts that include and exceed sexual. In one episode, she murders and then uses the blood of an enslaved newborn child as an elixir to ward off aging. One gets the sense that the possibilities for Black flesh are unending under her ownership. The infinite possibilities for fungible Black flesh mark a fundamental distinction between fungible slave bodies and non-Black exploited laboring bodies. And Black bodies cannot be incorporated into the human category of laborers. Then laborer would have no meaning if enslaved fungible labor meant that. So the concept of fungibility represents a theoretical framework within Black thought that addresses the remaking of bodies via Blackness as malleable and disposable flesh. And for those made fungible, the only escape is a flight from the enclosures of the law, to theorize a vision of the destruction of the European nation states as the only condition whereby Black people cease to be fungible objects of plunder, and gain freedom. And when Black people think about Native struggle, on the whole, it's to view Native people as other racialized bodies. But as Jody Bird has described, the implications of casting Indigenous self-determination as a product of continual racial exclusion is to basically cut off any idea of Indigenous relationships to our lands. And as she says, American Indian national assertions of sovereignty disappear into US territoriality as Indigenous identity becomes racial identity. For this reason, Native peoples resist being turned into racialized bodies under multiculturalism in Canada. And Native political imaginaries address collectives of collective territoriality, the land and governance. Even when we speak about the violence done to Native bodies, especially Indigenous women, they're still seen as a loss to a collective peoplehood, as bodies taken from land, turned into appropriated land. And the other thing is that in terms of Native theory, for so long, struggles for recognition from the state are being challenged. Some Native theorists advocate turning away from negotiating with the state in ways that just damage, are twisted into things that we don't want, but to focus instead on rebuilding our communities, relearning our languages, our spiritualities, our way of life. And then the struggle to get land back. And it's a process which ends up criminalizing people, the way that the people in Elsipogtog were criminalized to stop fracking. And that's sort of a primary process where Native people are at. But within Black theory, Indigenous peoples who are trying to get land are seen as somehow being like white landowners, attempting to ally with whiteness over Blackness. So one problem with these ways of theorizing, and I'm sort of boiling it down, but it's quite a set of arguments these days. One problem with these ways of theorizing is they're too abstract. They're built on fundamental misunderstandings of what Indigenous relations to land are. But I know many Black scholars who address indigeneity as much as they can. They understand the repercussions of residential school, child welfare, and criminalization. They don't attempt to shape Native realities into Black parameters. They understand the importance of Indigenous people's relationship to land. I think ultimately for Native peoples in relation to Black people, I think the question becomes, how do peoples forced through enslavement, and nowadays you can consider that with refugees as well, forced through no choice of their own to live on the lands of other people? How do you, other Indigenous peoples, how do you see your relationship to those lands? And the question, on the other hand, for many concerned Black peoples is, where are Black people going to be situated if Native peoples, negotiate a relationship with the government that is a sort of a government-to-government thing that only focuses on Native white relations? How can Native peoples expect Black people to act as allies when Native empowerment might potentially leave them alone, struggling with a racist state, while we sail off on our own lands? Not sail off, but you know what I mean. So these issues, I think, are all about a fundamental misunderstanding of the circumstances that the other faces. That as Indigenous peoples, too often we don't understand the circumstances that Black people face, and that Black people too often do not understand the circumstances that Indigenous peoples face. And what people call each other matters as well. At the same time in Nova Scotia, back to Nova Scotia now, back to the real issues. In Nova Scotia, where Black communities have been segregated and deliberately impoverished, most people know that Black and Indigenous peoples have more in common in Nova Scotia than between Black and Indigenous peoples anywhere else. But how we learn about each other is important. For example, the deliberate destabilization of the Black community in Africville, refused services, surrounded by toxic industries and garbage sites. It provided the excuse to impoverish the community by taking the land away and turning landowners into tenants. And yet the cry to remember Africville can grate for some Mi'kmaq people when nobody recognizes that the land that was taken from Mi'kmaq people to form Africville is Mi'kmaq land. The struggles of Black people who landed in Nova Scotia, either as actual slaves or as loyalists after the American Revolution or after the War of 1812, they were denied the land that whites got. But that cry that some theorists have had to have their land rights recognized retroactively, how is that to happen without validating how whites took Mi'kmaq land in the first place? And I think from what I can hear, from what I've heard in the past, the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq initiative at the Schulich School of Law in Dalhousie has been another point of contention. As I understand it, and I wasn't there, but this is what I've read about it, its establishment highlights two things: the manner in which Black people in Nova Scotia have long called themselves Indigenous Blacks. And this may be to distinguish between recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa, but from Mi'kmaq perspectives, isn't there another terminology? Because if, early Black settlers, Black people from the Maritimes, Black Canadians from Atlantic Canada, because if Black people are Indigenous to Mi'kma'ki, then who are the Mi'kmaq? And as I understand it, this program also had other conflicts. My only experience of this was at a conference in British Columbia, where somebody from that program stood up, a Black person stood up and said, as we always say, if you're Black, get back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're red, you will get ahead. And if you're white, you're right. And when I heard that, I said, my God, this history that Black and Native people have together, where does this idea come from? I think it came from the fact that the program, I think, was established from INAC funding, and Black people didn't understand why Native people should be funded. And Native people said, why are Black people coming into a program that was created for Mi'kmaq students? And I don't think that many of the Black people who had that kind of attitude understood that since that first treaty in, I thought, 1725 or 1726, Mi'kmaq people were hunted to almost extinction in some places by bounty hunters. Starvation policies and epidemics. By my grandmother's time, by the 1850s, people were still worried that Native people would go extinct. One more epidemic could do it, right? So to move from being the sole occupants of every inch of Mi'kma'ki with a powerful relationship to its lands to being small and fundamentally still impoverished. I'm speaking from the outside, but this is as I see it whenever I've gone to Mi'kma'ki. Um, it's the reality. Yeah, so INAC funds it. Big deal. But the other thing is recently, I'm aware of the time now, I'm almost at 7. A student of mine was researching how Black communities such as North Preston are establishing their Mi'kmaq ancestry, and that they have great pride in that ancestry and always have. And, she says that many have reached out to Mi'kmaq communities. And from what I've heard is that many Mi'kmaq are happy to acknowledge Black Mi'kmaq as Mi'kmaq people. But without understanding why it's important for Black Mi'kmaq people to address themselves as both Black and Mi'kmaq. A history of chattel slavery and anti-Black racism, which has affected a lot of communities, I think, in different ways. It can't be denied. So while understanding Black Mi'kmaq people as Mi'kmaq is important, so is, I think, an understanding from Mi'kmaq people, perhaps, that the difference that a history of chattel slavery has brought is a big one that can't be ignored. So to me, the title Living in Reciprocity seems to me to have highlighted that there are fundamental connections between Black and Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia that you don't see anywhere else in Canada. And not too many other places in, even in the US. And despite these differences in how each group understands each other, the fact that they've married together for generations, have built relationships together, and I think in many ways do understand that their futures are interconnected for better or worse. It's a tremendous example of the ups and downs, tensions and connections that truly embody living in reciprocity. Walalia, Nogma, thank you, all my relations.
My goodness. Thank you, Bonnie. That was most interesting.
I hope.
I will have to listen to the recording 3 more times to just really digest it. Thank you so much. It was so illuminating. We have about half an hour for questions, and please use the Q&A function. I don't see anything coming in yet.
So I hope it wasn't too, as you say, I worried that I was going all over the place too much, but I hope it made some connections.
Is there, I guess we are still processing that. Can I ask a quick question of clarification why people
Sure, yeah.
I was just going to ask you about the Cherokee, Seminole, the 5 so-called civilized tribe, because they were then expelled in, I think, 1834.
Yeah, I think that sentence I left out, because that part of the problem is not just that they enslaved people in the past, but they're still denying, the rights of Indigenous people, of their descendants, right? There was a treaty for each nation because they all ended up fighting for the South, right? Being physically located in the South, and for at least 4 of them being slaveholders, so they were required to bring in Cherokee, what they called freedmen, as citizens. And that worked fine. The Seminoles were really different because the Seminoles, because they had that history of alliances with Native people, with Black people, they actually, they still organized themselves as bands the way they had in the Southeast before they were removed. So they had 14 bands, and 2 entire bands were freedmen bands, which meant that they were kind of 1/7 politically of the entire nation. And the Seminoles, because they never really profited from plantation slavery, they're poorer than the other tribes. So part of the issue with them and the freedmen is that there was one money grant that, I mean, literally they're much more impoverished, because don't forget, plantation slavery enriches you. So the Cherokees were able to build these large buildings and, reestablish a plantocracy practically in Oklahoma. So did, to a lesser extent, much less extent, the others, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. But the Cherokees especially, they voted to exclude the freedmen. And part of the problem is that blood quantum was forced on Native people, but they are ignoring the ethical issues of the fact that they profited from the slavery of freedmen. And so they're now saying they're freedmen or just they're not Cherokee. Of course, the other problem is the Americans racially, like when they created roles to who is Native and who isn't, you were enrolled as Cherokees, as mixed bloods, as freedmen. And the freedmen, if you looked Black, didn't matter if your father was Cherokee, sorry, if your mother was Cherokee and had been enslaved by your father, you were listed as freedmen only. So now they can't get a certificate of blood quantum. And that's been the basis that the Cherokees have used to exclude them. So yeah. So that's the other really big question. Like, if it's bad enough that they did plantation slavery, but they're excluding the freedmen today. And that was a sentence that I somehow I might have deleted it by accident when I was trying to trim it down, but thank you for asking, because that's really important.
Thank you. I may follow up with you on that one, but in the meantime, questions are pouring in.
Okay. Yeah, people have processed.
The first one is from Anonymous. The Black community generally refers to cultural competence, while the indigenous population speaks of cultural humility. How significant is this distinction, and is it a hindrance to a more unified stance against racism?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I have no immediate answer. I mean, I think that the idea of humility, you know, is, I wouldn't say the basis is cultural humility, but everybody's careful to say who they're speaking on behalf of. Like, that's why I do this whole thing about what my own connection is to Mi'kmaq, because I have to be careful about who am I speaking for, right? I'm speaking for my family from, you know, from my own perspective in some respects. But in cultural competency, yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't know if that would make a real difference. I mean, if you're emphasizing culture, then in some ways, I think you have more connection than you don't. And we don't seek, here I'm talking like Mi'kmaq people, like I'm talking for Mi'kmaq people. As I see it, the issue is land, relationship to land, and cultural and spiritual relationship to land. And so empowerment doesn't figure into the equation in the same way. I think for Black people, maybe the need to struggle really hard to prove that you are, you know, you have to struggle 10 times as hard to, you know, to get where you need to go would make sense. But I think both of them work for their own people, you know, so I don't know if it hinders unity, and I don't know if it hinders both of us getting where we need to go. But thank you. I'm sorry if I don't think, you know, if I've answered it any better, but thank you.
The next one, and we only have till 7:30. I can't believe it. So a question from Sujaya Davantari. Could you speak to the Black Lives Matter movement, either in Nova Scotia or more broadly, in relation to movements such as Idle No More?
I can't really speak to Nova Scotia here. With Black Lives Matter, I mean, I wasn't even in Toronto when this was happening. We were mostly in lockdown. We did a little bit in Kingston, which is nearby, Ontario. But I think that I found it interesting that for Native people, supporting Black Lives Matter was really important. And I think the reason being that it allowed us to speak to the issues we faced as well. The connection to Idle No More. I mean, some people say that Idle No More never ended, right? That it just went into a phase of reflection. You know, it started off with opposing legislation, which is a different thing than opposing the murders, right? But I think what I know that Black Lives Matter did for a lot of Indigenous groups is, especially in areas of really, well, where isn't violence against Indigenous women happening, but it allowed us to speak about the murders of Native people by the police in ways that weren't being done before. So people allied with both Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter without displacing one or the other, you know. These are such good questions, but I'm not sure if I'm really able to answer them. But thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a question from David White. Thanking you first for the presentation. And the question is, do you think that the recent prominence of discussion of institutional racism in policing and the defund the police movement have helped increase alliances between Black and Native peoples?
I think so. Yeah, I really think so. I mean, I can't, that's as I see it. And mostly where I saw it is where you see lots of Native people supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting the murders. And I think I haven't heard a lot of people talking about defunding the police, but I think that struggles of decolonization by their nature would involve negotiating a different relationship to you know uh, Patricia Montour, the late Patricia Montour Angus, talked about how we have to stop relying on the police. The police brutalize us, right? We have to start relying on communities. She's about the only person I know who really openly said, we have to, it wasn't so much about defund the police, but in practical terms, our communities have to start defending themselves and finding ways to not rely on the police. In the north end of Winnipeg, for example, so many examples of women have been murdered before the police arrive to so-called protect them. Meanwhile, they're murdered by the police as well. So you're underprotected and over-policed. I think that, I think that, as I say, I can only speak about Patricia Montour Angus's perspective, but I think generally defunding the police would have resonance, especially in urban Native communities, Yeah. I can't hear you. You're muted.
I also have a cough, so I mute when I cough.
Mine has magically stopped doing it, right? I guess it's the adrenaline of talking.
Right, it appeared on my side. So a question from Sue Butkin. Actually, it's a comment. And rather than a question, as you say, I'm trying to absorb it, but I'm fascinated. I had no idea about any of this, and certainly not the breadth of knowledge Dr. Bonita Lawrence has shared. I am so appreciative of being here. So this is a huge thank you, and I'm sure many of us share in that sentiment. I certainly do. So I will perhaps move on to the next question. That's from Sarah Clift. Hello, Dr. Lawrence. Thank you very much for your talk. Many exclamation points. I wonder if you could tell us more about the notion of reciprocity in the context of identity politics. Do you see the notion of reciprocity as more fruitful, politically speaking, than siloed identities?
Definitely. It's Tiffany King who really has sort of developed this idea of relationships of reciprocity. Because I think I don't know whether it's been a survival value in Black communities. I suspect it has been. The idea that you have to live within community, you have to rely on community to, to survive. I think it's probably been a core value in many Indigenous communities. And the idea of communities living in reciprocity, meaning we aren't the same. We don't have to see each other through our own eyes, but we have to care for one another and know that our survivals are interconnected, right? And I think especially in the Maritimes, right? I don't think that there's any way that Black people's community, that Black communities and Native communities aren't there. It's not just a matter of the history together. You know, the racism in Nova Scotia. I had a Black Mi'kmaq friend she said that Nova Scotia is the Mississippi of Canada, right? And so, yeah, I think that the idea of reciprocity, yeah, and identity politics are so violent anyway. You know, either you're being policed for your indigeneity or you're being policed for your Blackness. You know, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's got it worse than one another. And I think the what is it, the struggle for who's got it worse, you know, is one that we have to overcome. So yeah, I think that it does mean that we do have to, our survival depends on one another, and we have to start reflecting it.
Thank you. We have two questions from Willem Watt, and I will read the first one. In rural areas of Nova Scotia, I remember many Black families taking a lot of Native foster children. How would this relationship of Black family Native children on Native land affect their relations? How do we do this well?
I think that, um, I mean, you know, my first reaction is, first of all, to remember that Native people also took in, I don't know how many Black people they took in, but they took in foster children from everywhere, Native. I've always been told that about Mi'kmaq communities. Everybody I know has you know, who's from Mi'kmaq has told me that. And I think in terms of Black people bringing up Native children, um, my own opinion, I would trust that a heck of a lot more than if white people are bringing up Native children, simply because surviving in a racist environment, Black people have that knowledge. Um, they obviously can't impart cultural knowledge, but they can work with Mi'kmaq communities to do so. So those are my thoughts. You know, if I don't know the circumstances under which they took in Native children, but I do think that um, any act of caring for a child is important, and I think especially if they want to teach them about Mi'kmaq people, then you know there's lots of opportunities in you know, in Nova Scotia to do so. That's the first question, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. Since we seem to have time, I will ask the other question from Willem Watt. Excuse me. There is a resurgence of people in the Caribbean who are reclaiming and revitalizing Amerindian cultural practices, even though many are much more Black and Asian in genetic makeup. Again, how do you think this will affect Native storylines?
Um, well, I mean, in the Caribbean, um, the especially like the Santa Rosa Carib community, they kind of know that some of what they know is from Black knowledge. Some of what they know is from Carib knowledge. And they don't worry too much about boiling down, was this Carib and was this Black? They look at what the community does now, how much they can figure out what their communities did in the past. Can any of those things be brought back? You know, I mean, so cultural revitalization for people who are culturally mixed, the way the Caribbean is really, it's a matter of survival. You know, there's been so much mixing between Indigenous and Black people in the Caribbean. Now, one of the communities in Dominica, there was one leader who was saying we should stop intermarrying with Black people because we need to conserve our native racial identity. But a lot of people opposed that. They said that's the way to destruction, to start to divide yourself that way. In terms of people who are more genetically one thing than another, I mean, I'm an example. You know, I could choose to carry on my mother's identity, or I could choose to abandon it. I am certainly more white and Acadian than I am Mi'kmaq, but her identity was passed on, and ultimately you have to choose, right? And what you see is more important. And so while knowing that I have Acadian relatives. I don't know them, but I know that they're there. And knowing that half my ancestry comes from the UK. Yeah, but you ultimately, how your family chooses to identify, has to do with their history, regardless of their genetic makeup. So yeah, so I don't know if the question is whether people who are more biologically non-native than native should identify as native, or whether their practices need to be separated. Yeah. So in the Caribbean context, it's not possible, I think. You know, the slavery and genocide mixed people together, and there you have it. And surviving it all. Like one of the things, Taino people in sorry, now Dominican Republic. Taino people are reclaiming their identity in Dominican Republic, and a lot of people have said this is about being anti-Black. They don't want to deny, don't want to acknowledge their Blackness. Dominican Republic, because of their terrible relationship with Haiti, basically Haiti being shoved out, being discriminated against, that could be a reality. But many people who are reclaiming their Taino ancestry acknowledge their African ancestry. They just don't want the Carib part, or sorry, the Taino part shoved out of the picture. And perhaps that's the case for many people who are mixed. It's like you're not allowed to be native if you're, that's supposed to be a part of your identity that should have vanished, right? Anyway.
Thank you. I don't see other questions pouring in. If anyone has anything else, please type it in. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions as a moderator, but
Sure, you are. Yeah. I mean, if there's no other questions,
yeah,
go
absolutely.
ahead.
I have another question, but just like speaking to your last comment, I've been kind of reflecting and actually uh, researching and writing about the concept of like the vanishing people. And what you have just said, like really forces me to revise, the kind of narrative of the vanished and extinct. It's very interesting. Thank you. Um, but the question I wanted to ask, because about that I can talk to you later, is whether you've been thinking about these reciprocal relations also in a kind of intersectional lens, that is perhaps what is the role of gender identity in either forging or complicating that reciprocity. If we consider that, European Western conceptions of gender and gender norms imposed and gender relations imposed on indigenous communities, like totally tore apart like the fabric of indigenous communities. And you also mentioned how indigenous women were no longer considered, as stewards of the land, etc. Just as one example, but then
No longer the mothers of this nation, of the nation.
so those like white gender norms were just genocidal in their own right. But then for Black people as well, just the very concept of chattel slavery, like the impact of the notion of family, the fact that children from enslaved women who were raped, were then kind of also considered chattel, but didn't take the status of the father on because they were just commodity. So it's just so, uh, uh, injurious on all grounds. So gender seems to play a huge role. Would that be a moment of reciprocity or further misunderstanding?
I think that gender roles have definitely, especially, I often wonder, my own mother, because she had to leave my father, had to leave the church, right? Brought up Catholic, right? But had to leave the church. So she was always rarely angry at the church because they sanctioned abuse for so long, right? In her case. And really, when you're in that situation and you have 5 kids, um, your survival is at stake and their survival is at stake. But I wouldn't say that. I think that Native communities, I mean, and here I'm speaking more because I live in Ontario, so I see much more of Anishinaabe communities. Uh, everybody I know at school is Anishinaabe, and they're all related, and they all come, I joke, but it seems like every second person, oh yeah, I know her, she's my cousin, and this is what I would know more if I lived in Mi'kma'ki and had been able to revitalize some relations, right? But this is how, but I think that I would venture to say it's the same in Mi'kmaq communities, but it's definitely the same around where I am, that women are still relied on completely in communities. They do the informal leadership, they keep families together, they do all of that. And there's a rhetoric, I don't know about in Mi'kmaq, there's a rhetoric where I live that you honor the women, but at the same time you can dominate them and everything else, right? So there's a contradiction between honoring the women and relying on the women, but the Indian Act gave power to Indigenous men. So I wouldn't say that the colonial process has, and the other thing is that it all becomes a little like, for example, when my mother was an adult, she considered herself to have moved away from the community, so was not connected. And we went back down east just before she died to try and rekindle some connections. And but as she grew older, she became our Mi'kmaq elder. You know what I mean? Like, it's like the things she knew growing up kind of came to the surface. So the role of women, it keeps being reproduced in a positive way, right? Um, you know, um, sure, colonization has affected how Native women are treated, I think, and how the Indian Act enforced that. Now, the Indian Act, how that worked in Mi'kmaq was different because it was imposed later, like in its full force, So, yeah. But I wouldn't go so far to say that that it has patriarchy has been imposed on Indigenous women in the same way that happened in Europe. There was a much longer and much more brutal period. Anyone who survived the witch trials pretty much learned to conform. But again, anybody who's had I know people who've had old European grandmothers who were like, are they very much different from Mi'kmaq grandmothers? I'm not sure, right? They still value family. They still usually have a connection to their land, wherever they are, and yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. In the meantime, I know that you are giving us so much, and even though not feeling that well, but there is one more question, if I could
Sure.
pose this. It's from Sujaya. You spoke of Brazil. There is an ongoing destruction and genocide of Amazonian peoples. Could you speak to the particular politics of race in Brazil?
What I do know is the Bolsonaro government, right? They're ruralistas. They're based on taking back the land from Indigenous peoples, and they'll destroy the Amazon to do it, right? And they're also destroying the Amazon so that they can have cattle and, put settlers on there. So yeah, the Bolsonaro, what's happening in Brazil is tragic right now, right? And it's a regime that's bent on it's a regime of large landowners. So yeah, it's happening really badly. Hello again, Catherine. I have to say, the Mi'kmaq Family was such an amazing film. The funny thing was I didn't know my grandmother very well. She died when I was 3. But my oldest sister, who knew her really well, said, my grandmother used to talk like that. Just that because her first language had been Mi'kmaq, right? Her way of talking was interesting, but it was so amazing. And I know there's been other films, but that's the only one I can think of right now. And you did, yeah. So I've loved your films.
Thank you. Kathy, if you are saying something, because you are muted.
You're muted.
I said, well, Alan, thank you.
Okay.
You. I think we are sadly arriving, at the end of this amazing event. And I have to say thank you for allowing us to record it, because I would really love to listen and learn and share it with students, those who haven't been able to be here today. I have one last question. When the restrictions are lifted, Bonita, will you come for a visit?
I would love to. Last time I went to the Maritimes, aside from my mother, was I was applying for a job at God, I can't remember, but it would have changed my life if I'd been able to settle in Mi'kma'ki, right? There would have been a revitalization there that you can't do from Ontario, right? So yeah, that would be wonderful. What I was going to say is why I got into this subject area. I went to a conference once in Oklahoma, and I encountered and the whole area of Black women of Cherokee descent, and suddenly this phenotypically Native guy came in and started attacking them and saying, "You guys were our slaves, and you're not Mi'kmaq. You're not Mi'kmaq as far. Sorry, you're not Cherokee as far as I'm concerned." And his friend to me was like a white supremacist, a Choctaw guy who was like, I don't know. I mean, we're seriously talking some Cherokees and Chickasaw, well, Cherokees especially, they can be 1/212th, or no, 1/1024th Cherokee, and they still count as Cherokee. And they're white in every respect when you're 1/2024th Cherokee. And the racism they expressed towards Black people. I went home to my family and I said, I've never seen white supremacist Native people before. This is, I have to look into this. And that's how it started, right? And that was about 10 years ago. So yeah, it did start me on a little journey there. But it would have been a lovely journey if I could have been hired in Mi'kma'ki. Would have been a different, rather than, I think I know more Anishinaabe than I do Mi'kmaq, right? I know all the terminology. I know how they pray. Whereas when I hear you talk in Mi'kmaq, it's like, oh my God, when we learned with Gabe Marshall, and he wasn't a linguist, he just taught us. We memorized words. He taught us phrases, but it's nothing like people actually speak, So it was lovely to hear you speak.
Thank you. Well, our time is coming to a close. If there's anything you'd like to say as a closing remark, Bonita, Kathy. I never know how to graciously conclude, those Zoom meetings.
I was trying not to sing along. I was so envious because you've known. I can't remember who you just mentioned. The family, the Denny family, and Sarah Denny. That you've known Sarah Denny, because I used to listen to her, the Denny family. I had a tape, and it was so I kept trying to sort of sing along, and I kept lighting up my side and blocking your side. So finally, I was just mouthing. It was wonderful.
Sarah Denny.
Oh yeah, she restarted, didn't she? So much of the music, she revitalized a lot of it.
Yeah. She devoted her life to bringing back our ceremonies and our traditions and dances and songs. And I was lucky to be taught by her and included by her everywhere. She told all 12 children, anytime Kathy is around, she comes with you. She's part of the family. And that makes you feel so proud and you feel connected, And her son, Joel Denny, just passed away last week.
Oh, really? Oh, my
Yeah.
goodness.
So we're losing a lot of the knowledge and we need it. I know we're trying to close. I'm in between panels. I'm over at another panel called the
Oh,
Wabanaki Teachings. So
oh,
there's
okay.
6 of us over there just having a discussion, and it's taped. So I'll send it to Dorota so you can listen to it. It's just awesome stuff.
I would love that. That would be so wonderful. I really appreciate that. Okay.
So would you like closing, Dorota?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. We'll be
Are
on.
we ready? Oh yes, it's 8:30. Yo ya he ya he yo ya he yo ya he yo. Thank you, Great Spirit, for thunder in the sky. Thanks for the seasons that are part of life. Thanks for the daytime and for the night. Thanks for the way of our lives. Yo ya he yo. Yo.
Thank you. Tahoe. Yes.
Salamat, Bonita. I know
Well,
Gabe.
Alan, Catherine.
I know
Kathy,
Gabe. I knew Gabe, and yeah.
yeah.
Glad
He
you-
he had his angers and everything else, but he did us he taught us a lot,
Yeah.
so thank you. Well Alan Dorotha as well.
Thank you
I'm
very
back
Okay.
over now. I'm going over to the Wabanaki Confederacy to learn a little more.
All right then, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
much. Bye bye. This is obviously to be continued. Thank
All
you.
right then, okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So shall I log out now?